Hey, everybody. Welcome to the September edition of Coffee with the Chief. We took a long break, really not a long break, but a break during the month of August just to catch up on some other things, but we're back. And I'm really excited that I have with me former FBI agent and media personality and also the mayor of the Cornwall-on-Hudson, Jim Gagliano. And Jim has had a long, successful career in the FBI. He has been on various media outlets such as CNN and Fox News, and he has a really interesting perspective on law enforcement, where we were and where we are today. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with Jim Gagliano. Hey, Jim, thanks for joining me this morning, and really excited to have you here. So why don't you introduce yourself, give yourself, a little background on yourself for those community members here that aren't familiar with you.
Sure. Well, as politicians are, we always want to lead with everything that makes us look good. So I graduated bottom of my West Point class in 1987. So I think that if anything, the chief knows he could have probably gotten somebody smarter than me if there was an honorarium a little bit more than he's paying me, which he told me was a coffee mug.
Yeah.
But, no, I graduated from West Point in 1987, spent 4 years in the Army as an airborne ranger with the 10th Mountain Division, entered the FBI in 1991, whole host of different capacities. I think, Chief, our paths crossed probably around 2008 when I was the FBI chief over Orange, Dutchess, and Sullivan counties in upstate New York.
Yep.
And I was working with $1 and a dream, trying to get some of the local chiefs to come on board to start a Safe Streets task force. And we put together a great group of meat eaters, of cops and troopers and agents, and did some damage in the region as far as taking out some of the worst of the worst. I left there in 2012, spent a few years overseas in Mexico City as a legal attaché, retired from the FBI in 2016, went to St. John's to get my master's. Now I'm working on my doctorate. I'm in the dissertation phase in Homeland Security on a doctorate that, interestingly enough, is on police use of force.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I currently serve as the mayor of the bucolic upstate New York enclave of the Village of Cornwall-on-Hudson. I've said too much. Most importantly, I'm a father. I'm married to the dean of the School of Business at Mount St. Mary College in Newburgh. I married way up, and we have a blended family, 5 kids and 2 adopted pit bulls. You got it all now.
Awesome. Wow, that's a big piece there. So now I don't know if you know, I am a St. John's graduate. So I have my bachelor's degree from St. John's.
What year did you graduate St. John's?
I graduated. Now I was going part-time at the end. So I graduated in 1997. So
Wow.
Quite a while ago. Jim Gillespie, who I'm sure you know Jim Gillespie. Do you know Jimmy? Jimmy was a detective in Middletown.
Okay.
And myself and Jim, we were going down at the end part-time. He actually ended up getting his degree from St. John's, married a woman that worked in the business office at St. John's, and now she's got a big title, and Jim does a little part-time teaching down there as well. So yeah, me and Jim would go down there 2-3 nights a week, some semesters, and we had a great experience at St. John's.
So you were there before me. So I got my master's in 2017, and I'm hoping to graduate this fall with my doctorate. But all I'm going to say to you is go Johnnies.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome. So is it, now that you're the mayor, I mean, you have a police department, a small police department, is it hard for you to step back and let the police chief kind of be the police chief, or no issues with that?
No, I think you need to talk to Chief Steve Dixon about that. He's probably going to say Galliano's a pain in my ass, but absolutely not. So another of the things that I do is I spent 4 years at CNN as one of their chief law enforcement analysts. I now work for CBS News, and I do some work for Fox News. And I'm also, I think this might be one of my proudest professional things. I am on the board of directors of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund out of Washington, D.C. So I'm one of 7 guys and ladies that determine when cops are unjustly accused of a crime, our agency takes them on and pays all their legal bills and helps their family out. So when you say, is it hard to pull back? No, I mean, my days of policing are over. I certainly have ideas. One of the first things I did, believe it or not, 18 months ago when I got elected here, was insist that our 13-member police force, we have 3 full-time officers, 10 part-time officers. We have a part-time chief, a full-time sergeant. One of the first things I mandated was body cameras. And, people say, well, you're pro cop, you worked in law enforcement, blah, blah. Why would you be that way? And my argument always is because body cameras, inordinately, they end up exonerating far more cops than they indict. The bad ones, I want them exposed. The good ones, which is the vast majority of them, when somebody comes in and says, he or she said this, we can go, let's go to the videotape. So, yeah, was it an adjustment, Chief? Yes. But am I okay with letting the professionals do that stuff now and moving back? And the answer is yes.
And we're very almost identically sized. I mean, in area, we have a bigger footprint because we're about 25 square miles, but we have 3 full-time officers. We have about 12 part-timers. We have a full-time sergeant, part-time me. So we're almost the same. We're probably, in fact, I just signed the voucher now for re-up for Axon. So we're into our 2nd or 3rd year even with the body cams for the same reason. So now let me ask you this before we step back, but your favorite position in the FBI, favorite assignment, I should say, in the FBI, best city that you worked in also.
So it's funny because I've always said that throughout my life and my career, and I've been blessed. I spent 33 years in federal government, 8 in the military, 25 in the FBI. And then I spent 2 years as a trustee in the Village of Cornwall-on-Hudson, ran for mayor in 2021, and I'm just coming up on the end of my first term. I always say that my last job was always my favorite. When I worked undercover in the FBI, it was the best job. When I worked the mob, it was the best job. When I worked drugs and gangs and when I was on an FBI NYPD task force down in Queens, best job. When I was overseas, best job. It's really, really hard to say. I say the same thing now. As you said, we have a lot in common, Mount Hope and Cornwall. Now, we're 2 miles by 2 square miles. We're a very small footprint, but we have 3,000 residents, and I got about a $7 million budget. That includes $3 million for the water department, which we cover for all of Cornwall, 16,000 people. But I have to say, all of that stuff before kind of prepared me for this. And I'm not a politician. I know I shake hands and kiss babies, and I had to run for office. But I promised I would only do 1 term. I will consider a second, and then I'm done. I'm a term limit guy. And I really believe this has been one of my most favorite things in life. When it came to the FBI, probably running the FBI Safe Streets Task Force, which included, when you were in the city of Middletown, which included cops from your from your municipality. That was great because we all lived so close to where we were policing. And for a guy like me, I had spent most of my career down in New York City or in Mexico or Afghanistan or in Virginia. I never had a chance to actually police where I lived.
Sure.
For those 4 years, we did a lot of great things, but I was also heavily involved in the community in Newburgh. So that, Chief, I'd have to say that was probably the one that kind of I appreciated the most.
Oh, that's awesome. So to shift gears a little bit, last 2+ few years, law enforcement's kind of had a little bit of a whiplash. We've, had the George Floyd murder and the incidents and the protests around that, up to the common day. So where do you see law enforcement today, globally or nationally? And where do you see it here in Orange County?
So I think, so writ large, I think the George Floyd, and you called it a murder, and that's what a jury decided. I mean, look, we all looked at it, and Derek Chauvin, that certainly wasn't a case back on Memorial Day of 2020 that the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund took on, because we all understand that what Derek Chauvin did was wrong. Do I believe the case was overcharged? Yeah. I wrote about it in the New York Post. I think Derek Chauvin should have gone to jail, but do I believe he should have gone to jail for murder? The answer is no. What he did was unconscionable. And we all agree that a jury decided it was murder. How did that change things? Well, everything in this country is a pendulum, and it always swings one way or the other. And unfortunately, we tend to overreact and to course correct. Is policing perfect? No. This country is 327 million people. There's about 700,000 to 800,000 law enforcement folks. They're not perfect, but the vast majority of them are. And the problem is we always tend, and I hate to use another cliche, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Does policing need to be professionalized? Yes. Do we need to make sure that police are held accountable? And there's a reason for that. We are armed instruments of the state. We have the ability to take somebody's liberty, deprive them of their freedom, and we have a responsibility, if necessitated, to take a life. That is a huge responsibility and obligation. Are all of us fit to do that job, Chief? I think you know as well as I do. The answer is no, but the vast majority, yes. Now, what happened post George Floyd was that the defund the police clowns, the asshats, and I can call them all other kind of names, but they caused the pendulum to swing back in this far left direction, which said that we need to reimagine policing. Look, do I think that social workers and mental health professionals should be involved in the process? Absolutely. Do I want them doing car stops? No. Do I want policing methodology tools like broken windows, stop, question, and frisk, CompStat to be thrown out and treated as racist because they're focused on neighborhoods where the crime is? Look, let's call it what it is. Most of the crime in our communities are in communities that are socioeconomically depressed. And mostly in the United States, those are communities of color. The amazing thing, and I'll wrap it up, Chief, by saying this. In 2020, at the height of the George Floyd protests and the riots, at the height of that, African Americans were polled. 81% of them said they wanted the same level of policing or more in their communities. Now, they'll push back and say good policing, which I know you and I ascribe to because I know your record. Yep. But that is so telling that they want more policing or the same level of policing. They don't want the police kicked out of their communities.
So so we've seen an increase in violent crime, across the state, across the country, specifically New York City. It's crazy you read what's going on down there in some of these really extreme instances. What do you attribute those increases to? I mean, people can say, well, it's because of COVID. It's because I still don't understand that connection. What do you see as the cause of the increase?
Sure. So I'll put it to you like this. So again, I said there's 327 million Americans. There are only 36,000 employees in the FBI and only 12,000 FBI agents. They cover all the United States and 63 overseas posts. The New York City Police Department has 36,000 cops. So there are 3 cops in New York City, a city of 8.4 million people, for every 1 FBI agent in the country and across the globe. New York City, under the former police commissioner Bratton and Rudy Giuliani, back in the early 1990s, looked at something that George Kelling and James Wilson came up with in 1982 called broken windows policing. What is that really quickly? It says that if you allow the small crimes to proliferate, it makes a permissive environment and climate where violent crime will start to grow, be nurtured, and proliferate. So in 1991, I'll give you this great statistic. Yeah. I'm a brand new baby FBI agent. I'm straight out of Quantico. I don't know my ass from a hole in the ground. I'm from Decatur, Georgia. You can't tell from my speech, my linguistics, and my accent, but I'm from Decatur, Georgia. I get sent to Queens, New York. At the end of 1990, the year that I arrived in New York City, city of 8.4 million people, 2,262 homicides, 95% of the perpetrators and the victims, people of color. In 2014, 2015, a year or two before I retired from the FBI after 25 years, no thanks to Jimmy Gagliano, we were down below 300 homicides in New York City. And why was that? because broken windows policing became the genesis of this notion that we can have safe communities. Times Square can be cleaned up. Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, the South Bronx, Washington Heights, Jamaica, Queens, places that were notoriously violent, they can be cleaned up. The pendulum now has swung back in the other direction. Those things are all considered racist. And until the communities there that are suffering the most, it's not the rich gated communities, it's not Coral Gables, it's places where they need the police. Until the pendulum swings back the other way, Chief, we're going to see crime continue to rise.
So I was sitting in an auditorium in Chicago, Illinois, 2016, and your former colleague, James Comey, was the speaker, and he talked about the Ferguson effect. And of course, the next day, he backed off a little bit after President Obama criticized his comments there, and James kind of walked a little bit back what he said. But he at that time thought the police were not being proactive because of at that time the incident in Ferguson. Do you think the Ferguson effect is real, and do you think some of the increase we're seeing now is related to I don't want to call it the Floyd effect, but however you want to call it?
Yes and yes. So you're talking about the speech at Georgetown University back in February of 2015 that James Comey gave. And I've quoted from that. I am no James Comey fan. I believe James Comey did some demonstrably wrong things and got away with it. However, when he had the courage to touch the third rail in law enforcement, which was to say that policing as a profession, going back to the 17th century in this country, is an imperfect vessel, I applauded that. And when he said that the vast majority of people that are attracted to the policing profession don't join it because they're racist and they want to be the man and put the hammer down and kill people and hurt people and be racist. They do it because they have a sense of, I want to help, I want to do good. Now, what he talked about was an uncomfortable conversation. The vast majority of violent crime in this country happens in a particular demographic. And I'm happy to talk about that. 52% of all violent crime, and I'm studying this as part of my dissertation, happens in the African-American community. We can argue socioeconomics, and I agree. We can argue the history and policing going back to the 17th century with the slave patrol. We can argue all those things, and it's righteous. But for us to pretend that police officers that are working in tough neighborhoods that have to come home at night and want to get through their shift in one piece, they're going to treat that the same way they do in some bucolic suburb or someplace up in the west, the upper, west side of Manhattan, is unfair. James Comey confronted that. He said, look, communities of color have a right to say, we've been treated differently. But also understand that police officers that work in those areas that are high crime areas, they have a right to say, I deserve to come home to my family, my children, my wife, my husband, the same way that you do. It's an uncomfortable topic. And unfortunately, we talk past each other and we operate in echo chambers. And if you say that, some people will scream you're racist. And if you argue that policing is imperfect, other people say you're not patriotic. Chief, until we can get past talking past each other and talk about some of these uncomfortable truths, we're whistling past the graveyard.
What do you think about the bail reform? What can we do? What's the single biggest thing we can do to fix? I don't call it bail reform. I say it only because I think it's easy to say bail reform. It's not reform. We've changed the bail system. We didn't reform it. We made it worse. But what can we do, in your eyes, the single most important thing to fix it? We were at a press conference a few weeks ago talking about the unintended consequences. What is it that we can do to take care of that?
It is one of the single-handedly worst pieces of legislation ever. And this is what happens when you have a supermajority and you don't have divided government. Now, people look at divided government. We're a binary country. You're either, and depending upon which side you're on, you're with us or you're with the terrorists. You're one of the other. So the fact that in Albany, upstate New York, where our assembly is and where our Senate is and where the governor is, the fact that that is one party. Now, I was a registered independent for 1,000 years. I only became a registered Republican because in New York State, They don't allow you to vote in elections during primaries unless you're on one side or the other.
Yep.
It has nothing to do with my party affiliation. If it was all Republican up there, I don't agree with the supermajority that way. And the fact that the Democrats control all the levers up there, and this was a cowardly position. They argued that. And some of these folks, many of them are my friends, and I talk to them all the times on the political end. They argue that bail reform and discovery reform, which is equally pernicious, were passed because it was part of an omnibus budget. And if they didn't agree to pass it, the entire New York State budget would shut down. Now, that is cowardly. Why bail reform? Something that says, hey, look, there's no cash bail for people who are recidivists. This guy's been a pickpocket. This guy has been a shoplifter. This guy's been a violent felon over and over and over again, but we don't want to cause them to have to put up cash bail. And what does that do? It takes away the judicial discretion of a judge to go, I get it, but in this case, I'm remanding you. In this case, I see that there's no sense in jailing you before trial because we're all innocent until proven guilty. Chief, bail reform has single-handedly led to where we are right now with the violent crime epidemic. The same people are being released over and over and over again to reoffend. It's insanity.
I agree with you 100%. And I think it's that we had and I know it's not a big deal on the grand stage. We have a guy going around, he's breaking into cars. And at the end of the day, between Mount Hope and Greenville, Minnesota, a couple other areas with us and the state police, we're up to like 30 cars. So finally we catch the guy and he gets a ticket, basically, right? We give him a ticket. And now I have to call a couple of the victims, one of which was an elderly couple who was petrified because he actually went to their house twice, right? And they're like, is he in jail? And I said, unfortunately, no, he got a ticket. And they were just, and I said, don't worry, he's not coming back. You're fine. Call us and we'll be there, you know. But to explain that to people, and I still don't understand how that got past people, but some people, I guess, weren't paying attention. And you explain that, and they're like, wait, this is craziness.
Yeah. So there was I believe it was on Netflix. There was a Netflix documentary about a kid by the name of Khalif Browder. And Khalif had been, he had been accused. It was alleged that he had stolen the backpack. He had done a strong arm robbery of some young kid and stolen the backpack. The kid ended up, I think the bail set was, $900. That's what he had to put up. And the family couldn't make bail. He spent his time at Rikers for 3 years. When the DA ultimately dropped the charges, and again, a DA who I believe was either African-American or Latino, this was not a racial thing, right. But when the charges were eventually dropped and he got out, he ended up killing himself. Now, look, that is an awful scenario. Whether or not he was guilty of stealing a dopey backpack or not is one thing, but the fact that he was stuck in jail for 3 years as his case continued to get put over and put over and put over. I understand the frustration, but as I say to people all the time, the American criminal justice system is imperfect. Show me a better one. If you think there's a country where there's a better one, show it to me. And I'll also say this, Chief, if you think the American judicial system is racially skewed, you're wrong. It is skewed against the poor. Because if you're O.J. Simpson, you can buy the best defense that money can buy, a defense that you or I, as public servants, could not afford. It is skewed against the poor because the poor are required to get a public defender, and there's a lot of good ones, but they're overworked, they're under a huge caseload, and sometimes people don't get the defense that they deserve. The Khalif Browder case, I believe, this is a world according to Jimmy Gagliano, is what caused the bail reform hysteria. And now up in Albany, they don't have the courage to come back and say, we made a colossal error. Let's junk this. And that's where we are.
All we got to do is give judges discretion. That's all we really have to do. Give them discretion. And if they're abusing their discretion, then there's ways we can address that.
100%. They either get voted out or the next time around, they don't get reappointed. There are mechanisms in place, But I agree with you. The Jersey system is actually better. Even though they have cashless bail, they do allow for judicial discretion. It doesn't happen in New York, or it doesn't happen at the level that it needs to occur. And until that changes, until we have politicians up there that have the courage to say, we made a mistake. But unfortunately, in academia, we need years of data. And right now we have 3 years worth of data. And there's people that argue, Jimmy, causality is not correlation, or correlation is not causality. So just because of this, we don't have enough data. At some point in time, Chief, they got to make a change. This is literally a huge piece. In fact, I'd argue the linchpin behind where we are right now in New York State and other places with violent crime proliferating and on the rise.
Now, who's your professional mentor? Do you have a professional mentor?
Wow, I would say this. So my family was never a law enforcement family. My family, going back to the Civil War, I have family members on both sides that fought in every war in this country, in every conflict, with the exception of World War I. In 1917, we just didn't have any 18, 19, 20-year-old guys.
Gotcha.
So we fought in every war. Nobody in my family was a cop. Nobody was in law enforcement. I went this way. I would have to say that James O'Keefe on the law enforcement end, my father's my greatest mentor. He's on the long goodbye right now. He's got Alzheimer's. We unfortunately had to put him into a home a couple of years ago, but he's still my hero. But Dr. James O'Keefe, who's the provost at the Staten Island campus of St. John's University, who worked as a deputy commissioner in the NYPD and then retired as the deputy chief in Houston. He's kind of been my mentor on the academic, arena.
Gotcha.
The rest of it, I learned the same way that you did. I got in there and I mixed it up. I made mistakes. I learned this. If you touch this, this happens. If you do this, that doesn't happen. And I learned along the way. But I'd say my father and probably Dr. James O'Keefe.
Okay. We're getting ready to give a police exam in Orange County in the next month. I think it's scheduled for. I was out with some other chiefs. We're doing some recruiting to try to help out with the numbers. You hire people as the mayor. You've been through the FBI. What would you say for people looking to get into law enforcement? What are the 3 most important traits or characteristics that you look for when you're sitting down to hire someone to be that person that's working for the Cornwall-on-Hudson Police or for the FBI or any agency?
I would say judgment, discernment, and humility. Now, I always go back to this. I came back to the New York office in 2001 after spending 4 years on the FBI's hostage rescue team. And when I became the SWAT team leader for the New York City office of the FBI back in 2002, one of the things that I did during the selection process is I did the same thing we did on the hostage rescue team. I would call guys in for interviews, and then I'd say to them, tell me about a time in your life that you were scared out of your mind. Describe it to me. And the people that would look at me and they're trying to play 3-dimensional chess, and they're going, well, I've never been scared and I can do this job, blah, blah. Those are the people I don't want. I want the people that go like me. I've been scared out of my mind. The difference between us and regular people, it's not the absence of fear. It's the ability to control your fear. We're all scared. I've been scared a million times. I'm sure you have.
Absolutely.
So I would say that type of discernment and humility, and then also judgment. People ask me all the time because I do a lot of speaking, and I'm sure you're going to put the check in the mail for this conversation, because when I do it for TV, I get paid for this. But when I do it at like a Boys and Girls Club or a library or to a student union or to a police group, I always say this. I get questions from young folks all the time, and it's usually like this. How many people did you shoot? And I say to people all the time, I was lucky. I was never in a position where I actually pulled the trigger. And could things have been different? Absolutely. But I want to tell you this. When I say you, the people that you're talking about, that are going to take this test, that are going to be hired by Mount Hope or hired by the Village of Cornwall-on-Hudson. I just hired a full-time police officer. I just hired 2 part-time police officers. We have turnover like every profession. I always say this. In 25 years on the job, these two things, and this handled, de-escalated, and took command of situations much more than the steel. And we're all handy with the steel, and it's there, and it's a tool, and we need it. but 99.99999% of the time, communication, body language, tone, and the words that you choose are the margin of victory in policing.
And we can both talk about people that we've worked with that did not have those skills mastered, and you hated going on calls with them because you knew they were going to say the wrong, and not bad people, but they would say the wrong thing. They would, and you'd be on this call and you'd like, what the heck? That's, worst call to be on with the guy. So what do you do to relieve stress? I mean, you're a high intensive guy. What do you do to relieve stress?
So it's funny, when I was a kid, I remember there were some of my dad's buddies. And then when I joined the FBI in 1991, and I was a wet behind the ears kid, knew nothing about law enforcement. And I get to my first squad out in Queens on C-16, which was the Gambino organized crime squad, the squad that had the John Gotti case. And I remember there were some old time guys that had just retired. They were Hoover era, J. Edgar Hoover era guys. And they're like, kid, I've been retired. I've never been busier. And I'd be like, shut up. What are you talking about? I get up every morning at 4:30. I leave at 5. I get home at 8 o'clock at night. What are you talking about? Chief, I retired in 2016. Yeah. I have never been busier. So my second act. So I left the FBI because I desperately wanted to teach. And at 25 years, I refused to go to headquarters. I knew that there was going to be, I was never going to become an assistant director because I didn't want to go to DC. I knew it was time. And then when TV and the media thing happened, and then when this opportunity came up to run, and I'm not going to attach any names to this, but I was upset by certain politicians locally that were marching with groups that had defund the police signs and that were demonizing the police. I had no interest in going to politics, but I said, that's not going to happen on my watch. I may lose, but I'm going to run my ass off, and I'm going to show you how you can hold police accountable and at the same time defend your men and women, because they're the ones out there, the thin blue line between us and the riffraff. So when I did that, it was a reflexive response. But all of a sudden I was like, wow, now I have a good idea. I've been in the federal government, but now I've been in local government, and I've had to figure out ways to make the water come out clean, to make sure the fire department responds, the police are available, to make sure that my DPW guys patch the potholes, make sure the roads get paved, the trees get trimmed, all those things. I haven't done my second act yet. When I leave this job, and it will either be in March or 2 years from March, and I haven't decided yet, right. My job is going to be armed with a doctorate, armed with a PhD in Homeland Security and focused on police use of force, defending the honorable, noble men and women of law enforcement in the media. That's going to be my second act. So this is all prepping for that.
All right, I got one last question. I like to ask this because it helps me, and I think it helps other people. A book suggestion. And I know it's hard for you because you're teaching, you're doing things for your study, academia, and it's hard to do that. But what's a book suggestion from Jim?
I'm going to give you two. How about that? Is that okay?
And I'll tell you what, I'll be honest with you. I go out and I go on Audible or I go on my Kindle and I get these books and I read them. All right. So you got Human Diversity
by Charles Murray.
Yep.
And In Context by 3 police officers that explain police killings, police involved deaths, officer involved shootings, and context. And I think for me, the thing that I've learned on this doctoral pursuit at St. John's is that a lot of the things when we have these knee-jerk reactions, or when we all have to take a side, you're either with us, whoever us is, or you're with the terrorists. Understanding context. You want to criticize J. Edgar Hoover, the man who formed the modern FBI, served for 48 years as the FBI director from a 29-year-old kid in 1924 till he died in 1972 under 8 presidents, Calvin Coolidge to Richard Nixon. Criticize him. The guy was born in 1895. The social mores back then were not the same social mores in 2022. What the book In Context does is it tries to put these things into perspective. And I think, Chief, it's so important because you talked about the Ferguson effect. I'm going to call that something else, the viral video effect. You take a small snippet a video segment of something that happens. You don't get the before, you don't get the after, and you look at that and say, well, that guy shouldn't have done that. Really? But you had the benefit of stop action camera, slowed it down, heightened the light, because this was under low light conditions, in context. And I think Graham v. Connor, which is something I'm going to tell, if you've got young people that are watching this, 1989 Supreme Court case, go back and learn it. It's the objective reasonableness context, which says, yes, you can argue that was a bad shoot, but what if you were in that position with the same level of training, the same low light conditions, and the same in extremis situation, life or death, you got to shoot, run, do this or that. Graham v. Connor. And I think that is so important as you put this out there, and hopefully some young people that want to become cops, want to become a police chief like you someday, will look that up and understand that is the line of demarcation. That's how we judge people. Objective reasonableness.
I agree with you 100%. 100%. Well, I really want to thank you for joining me today. It's been great. It's been fun. And I don't have a check to mail you, but I will mail you a mug. I gotta hold it up to the camera.
You can't afford me. It's going to cost you a mug, and it's going to cost you a beer the next time I see you.
Well, I guarantee you I can do that for you. So Jim, thanks for joining us, and I hope to be able to see you to pay off that debt.
Sounds good, Chief. Thanks for having me.